We are starting. We have kind of a strict time schedule that we have to follow, and we have to be out by this, we finish there about 5 o'clock. And now I'm really happy to present Andrew Perchuk. He's a well-known art historian. He's the assisting director of Getty Institute, and he was one of the main organizers of the Pacific Standard Time art in LA from 1945 to 1980s. And he's already kind of briefly been introduced in the previous lecture from Judy Chicago. And he's going to talk about, or his name of his speech is, You Say You Want a Revolution, Feminist Art in Southern California. So please welcome Andrew Perchuk.
Thank you, Mama. I'll tell you, Judy Chicago is a tough act to follow, but I will do my best. But I want to thank Lisa Pacini, Gidsken, Braadlie, and Elizabeth Schei for organizing this wonderful symposium and for inviting me. I'm very excited to be in Norway for the first time. Or is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Better?
Yeah.
Okay. I know one of the prime motivations for this symposium is to address the situation of women artists in Norway. And while I don't have much to offer on that subject yet, I can offer some reflections on how another group of women artists responded to the conditions they found in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s, creating the first generation of feminist art. If one were to use a single word to describe the situation of women artists in Southern California before feminism, that is in the 1950s and 1960s, that word would be bad. Can I have the first slide? Helen Lundberg, whose wonderful painting Blue Planet you're looking at here, was one of the founding members of the Hard Edge painters who called themselves abstract classicists. She was one of the group's leading thinkers, writing some of their manifestos, and was always included in the exhibitions the group organized themselves in the 1950s, along with the male artists Lorsa Feidelson, John McLaughlin, Frederick Hammersley, and Carl Benjamin. Slide. Nevertheless, when the first major museum exhibition was organized of these artists' work in 1955, Lundberg was considered conspicuously absent, and the show was referred to only as the 4 abstract classicists. In other words, just the 4 men. The omission was particularly grievous, as 4 abstract classicists was the exhibition that really put Los Angeles art on the map. Traveling to the ICA in London in 1960, where it made an enormous impression on David Hockney and other young artists struggling to move away from the influence of abstract expressionism. So when Los Angeles art first got any kind of international recognition, it was entirely male artists. And of course, what happened to Lundberg was not an isolated incident. Judy Chicago recounts that when the famous curator Walter Hopps visited the studio she shared with her male partner at the time, Hopps simply refused to even look at her work. The situation reached something of a nadir. Next slide. When the Los Angeles County Museum of Art organized the Art and Technology exhibition. This was one of the world's first blockbuster exhibitions. It took the entire resources of the museum for 3 years with the idea of pairing artists with corporations to produce a new high-tech art. And it produced some well-known works. You're looking at Robert Rauschenberg's Mud Muse, which some of you may have seen at the Moderna Museum in Stockholm. Next slide. But when the exhibition opened, as the cover of the catalog makes clear, not a single woman artist was included. It's quite a document. The state of affairs was so egregious that it led to one of the first organized protests by women artists. And when the curator of this exhibition, Maurice Tuckman, next slide, continued to exclude women from his shows, women picketed the museum wearing masks with Tuckman's face on it. Those are the women with their Maurice Tuckman masks on the top. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. We're well into the feminist era. So how did we get from a time when the exclusion of Helen Lundberg produced absolutely no commentary to an era when women artists were prepared enough that 100 protesters could turn up on short notice to demonstrate? In the late 1960s and early 1970s, women organized through their art, through education, and through the building of institutions. While I would discuss the founding of the feminist art program and other institutional activities, this afternoon I will focus primarily on the way women artists in Los Angeles combated male chauvinism through their art. What I'm going to argue is that feminist artists brilliantly transformed some terms that artists like Judy Chicago, Peter Volkas, Robert Irwin, Edward Schei had already established for Los Angeles art. But what they did that was so important is they converted these terms from being apolitical, universal, and abstract to being engaged, gendered, and embodied. The most important of these shared concerns for this talk being craft, perception, and place. Next slide. So what did craft look like in Los Angeles art before feminism? It looked like Peter Volkas's Little Big Horn of 1959, this massive ceramic sculpture that you're looking at. And it looked like, next slide, Robert Irwin's disc paintings that some of you may have had a chance to see at some point. And why was craft so important? It was, in many ways, the cornerstone, in some ways, as Judy described it, of everything Southern California artists sought to achieve, whether their ultimate goal was material or perceptual. For Irwin, for instance, staying with him, the question of craft was paramount. In fact, absolutely constitutive of the difference between a perceptual art and a conceptual art. In other words, artists on the West Coast were trying to make an art of perception and not of conception, which is what they thought of New York art as being. So what Irwin says is there's a consistency to physical objects that somehow reads all the way through. And if there are mistakes in there which your senses pick up and which contradict or lie in some way, then the area of craft has failed. What bears further exploration, starting with the ceramics of Volkas, now the next slide, which first put the question of craft at the forefront, is the nature of the craft that instructed the practices of artists in Southern California. So, for one thing, this craft precludes a simplistic identification with the well-made object. That is, that craft is not just that these things were beautifully made, especially if this is defined in terms of medium. So you're looking at Little Bighorn, and with its cracked, jutting masses, it was not considered a well-made ceramic work within the established terms of the discipline at the time. But what Volkas demonstrated in works like Little Bighorn is that a viable ceramic practice could instead be based on a thoroughgoing retraining of artistic skills and such principles as a destabilization of medium, a liberation of color, and an engagement with technology, all qualities that became fundamental terms in the practice of Judy Chicago and other Los Angeles artists in the 1960s. To focus on the last of these principles, the turn to industrial technology, which Judy's already talked a little bit about, already existed in ceramics, but its position was greatly intensified by Volkas and his colleagues. First, what Volkas did was he modified the electric potter's wheel, and those of you who have made ceramics know spinning on the wheel is sort of the basic of that. And what he did is he increased the horsepower from 1/4 to 1/2, allowing them to work on much larger masses of clay. So before that, a large clay object was maybe 20 kilos. This is about 300 kilos. Next, Volkas crucially adopted 2 pieces of factory equipment from disparate industries for use in the ceramic studio. He brought in enormous humidifiers designed for fruit packing plants, repurposing them so that large masses of clay would not dry out while being worked on. And then brought in giant dough mixers from bread factories capable of mixing hundreds of pounds of flour or powdered clay, making it possible for some works to weigh up to half a ton. And these innovations were central to transforming clay from a material in an objet d'art context to a sculptural material able to be used in an industrial scale. Next slide. Judy, as she's talked about, was unquestionably one of the artists who carried industrial craftsmanship furthest by training herself in several industrial fields. Auto body mechanics to create her early sprayed pieces, boat building for her plastic paintings, and pyrotechnics for her atmospheres. As Judy said of her practice, and I'm quoting, "You have to remember the history of my work. When I wanted to learn to use a spray gun, I went to auto body school. When I wanted to learn to lay out fiberglass, I went to the boat works. When I wanted to learn how to do fireworks, I went to the fireworks company. I have a long history of apprenticing myself to whomever knows the techniques I'm interested in." You're seeing one of her great fireworks performances, which was done at the old Norton Simon Museum in Los Angeles. So what does this excursus into art and industry demonstrate? First, it shows a very different relationship to technology on the West Coast than on the East Coast, where it's hard to imagine Dan Flavin introducing a new production method for fluorescent tubes, or Carl Andre reformulating fire bricks. Yet because the techniques used on the West Coast were not really high-tech, artists could be the hands-on innovators and not just the repurposers of off-the-shelf technology or merely the supervisors of fabricators. However innovative this craftsmanship, the craftsmanship, however innovative, would not be consequential unless it produced significant art. Next slide, please. And one of Judy Chicago's earliest spray pieces, this is the car hood that we had in Pacific Standard Time, demonstrates how incredibly nuanced this new technique could be in the relation between color, surface, and shape. Judy, as she said, this was her valediction, her graduation piece from auto body school. And it was painted on the hood of an actual early 1960s Chevrolet. So this is really a car hood. It is in many ways a three-dimensional hard-edge painting, extending the lessons of Helen Munderberg's work with a composition that contrasts complementary blues and oranges to striking optical effect. As you can see, the central design of concentric blue-orange circles bisected by an orange cross shows the enormous precision of Chicago's spray technique. while also avoiding the sometimes visually distracting raised edges of more traditional brushed hard edge technique. Chicago makes extraordinary use of the undulations of the hood to enhance her flared design, most remarkably in the employment of the elevated center line. You can see the center is actually literally elevated. Painted in the deepest blue to pierce the central concentric design. However, the design in car hood is not entirely abstract. Instead, and as Judy has sort of said, it combines what she calls her male and female imagery, an inclusion that caused her considerable trouble at this early stage in her career. The reaction to her car hood had one critic associating the work with a popular book that argued that blatant sexuality was the means by which Detroit manipulated people into buying cars. So now I'm quoting from that article. Judith Garowitz, as Judy was known at that time, painted car hood also eschews any connotations of motorized power in order to play with the decorative surface and erotic symbolism of the automobile. Car hood might be a cover design for the insolent chariots. Next slide. And as Judy's also alluded to, she herself admits that partially due to the negative reaction for these early pieces, she intentionally suppressed the sexual imagery in her work, producing the minimalist works including rainbow pickets, which you're seeing here, Trinity 10-part cylinders, that would bring her to prominence in exhibitions such as Primary Structures and American Sculpture of the 1960s. And I think that Judy, those were two of the shows that really introduced minimalism to the world. And I think Judy was actually the only woman who was in both exhibitions. But what did craft, which we've been talking about, look like after feminism? This is bound up with the question of what women did to combat sexism. And one of the most important things they did was organize. In 1970, Chicago founded the feminist art program at Talstad, Fresno, an out-of-the-way state university in the middle of California. And you really can't get much more out of the way than Fresno. Chicago made two crucial decisions in founding the program. She would only teach women, and she would physically separate the program from the rest of the campus. As she said when she was leaving New York for Fresno, and I'm quoting, "I'm going away for a year. I'm going to teach a class only for women. After next year, I will never teach again except women. Because I need to be with women as much as women need to be with me. I need to help girls feel secure, that they can realize themselves, that they can be aggressive, that they can be assertive, that they don't have to step back, that they don't have to hide the pressures that all women, all girls feel as long as a man is in the room." That's the end of the quote. This may seem extreme by today's standards, but I think it was a courageous way to combat centuries of art making and art history that excluded women. Thank you. And the next year, Chicago brought the feminist art program back to Los Angeles, to CalArts, in partnership with Miriam Shapiro. They continued the radical experiments in art teaching that Chicago had pioneered at Fresno. So as Judy said, and she's publishing a book, a new method of art teaching was as central to the beginnings of feminism as a new method of art making. And these pioneering teaching methods emphasize in many ways collaboration. As Shapiro recalls, I began to think more and more what it took to make a classroom scene work. Most of the girls had a minimum of art in their background, but they had a high potential for humanity, which allowed them to create art out of their real feelings as soon as Judy, their teacher, gave them permission to do so. So the end of the quote, they initiated consciousness raising by sitting in a circle as a group and discussing a topic. And Shapiro continues, in the classical women's liberation technique, the personal becomes the political. Privately held beliefs imagined to be personally held hang-ups turn out to be everyone's feelings, and it becomes possible to act together on their solution, if there is a solution. Our use of this technique serves a different purpose. We are artists. We search for subject matter. Next slide. The subject matter they were searching for quickly took shape when some of the women found an abandoned mansion and they received authorization to transform it into an environmental art project, which became the landmark exhibition Woman House. And you were looking at the cover of the catalog with Judy and Miriam Shapiro sitting on the steps. In this collaborative exhibition, craft took on a new meaning in Los Angeles art. First, it became identified with new skills. The house was completely dilapidated and broken. So what the women first did was to replace broken windows, built new walls, refinished floors, painting, plumbing, electrical work, as the women transformed the dilapidated building into a usable space. Second, craft moved away from the industrial and the macho. As Judy was saying and I was showing, craft really meant this working with the spray gun, with auto body and plastic technology. So it ceased to be abstract now, the feminist, and introduced content based on the women's lives. Shapiro makes this new orientation explicit, and I'm quoting from her again. Art as we women know it is sewn, embroidered, quilted, tatted, woven. These are the domestic arts. Not that we love Artemisia Gentileschi or Angelica Kaufman or Sonia Delaney or Natalie Goncharova less, but we all of us women know our arts more. Next slide, please. As we look at the works the women created, such as The Dining Room by Miriam Shapiro, Faith Wilding, Beth Batchenheimer, Karen Lecoq, Robert Mitchell, and Sherry Brody, which just shows how collaborative these works were with the number of artists involved, we come to realize that everything in the room has been crafted by the group. In other words, that is not a dining room as they found it. And that they made everything from the vinyl sculpture to the oversized fruit. The fruit on the table is actually sculpted out of bread dough. And here, craft has become gendered, or in some sense maybe regendered. It has become women's work, inspiring a generation of artists to think outside minimalism, to think outside the mainstream at the time. So speaking about minimalism, or these artists moving beyond minimalism, foregrounds the question of perception, which of course is the center of minimalism. So what did a perceptual art look like in Los Angeles before feminism? Next slide. It looked, as you've seen before, like Robert Irwin's disc paintings, which really don't reproduce. I mean, the photograph doesn't tell you much of anything, so you're going to have to bear with a little bit of description. So Irwin created these works by having subtly convex discs shaped for him in the same manner that parts at the time were made for race cars. He then painted them with a spray gun, same technique as Judy's, with the sprayed lacquer applied at such a distance that it would dry upon hitting the surface of the metal, giving the center of the disc a highly textured, grainy buildup. So it's not, the texture is not even across the painting. The outer areas were sprayed in concentric circles of color, moving in one example, which you see here, from warm green to yellow, pink, blue, brown, violet, but so finely done that even close up it's nearly impossible to make out individual colors or the boundaries between them. When the installation of these paintings is just right, and just right means that there are 4 lights from all 4 corners directed at the painting. The disc floats as one circle in a roseate pattern of circular shadows that are projected on the wall. You can see that the shadow is as much part of the work as the disc in the middle. The combination of the cross illumination and the ambient light, which softens both the edges and interiors of the shadows, produces the effect that the disc, shadows, and illuminated area of the wall are seen as a single entity. That is, you can't really tell where the painting begins and the wall ends. Without any hierarchy of focus, there's a constant shift between the elements. The colored areas of the disc may at one moment appear more positive in the shadows, but at the next, the shadows have more tangibility than the disc. The grainy textural quality of the paint, the color of which matches the wall behind, combines with the special lighting to give the center of disc a field density that makes the reflected light appear solid, opaque. This solidity melds the center of the disc to the wall while erasing many of the visual clues we use to judge distance. A further perceptual destabilization is produced by the shadows, which are not flat, as they possess no even degree of shading. This difference in light and dark breaks up the wall, which no longer reads as a flat, solid surface, and becomes impossible to precisely locate disc, shadows, or wall in a mappable geometry or conceptual space. In other words, these are very, very hard to fix in your vision. And in many ways, the paintings are a magnificent accomplishment. If one of the primary goals of abstract painting since Picasso's Cubism was to eliminate the figure-ground distinction within a composition, Irwin extended this to eliminate the distinction between the painting itself as a figure and the surrounding space as a ground. In other words, erasing the distinction between what is inside and what is outside the frame. So in other words, you can't tell here where the painting begins and ends, and where the gallery space around it starts. In doing so, we upset the normal hierarchy of our perception, which in looking at art, claims that the painting is the important thing to see, and the wall on which it hangs can be ignored. In the disc paintings, perceptions normally conceived of as peripheral or incidental now dominate to such an extent that centered vision can no longer order them. The disc paintings are characterized by continual pulsation as the entire visual field of the viewer shifts in time and space. This makes vision a truly kinesthetic experience and a profoundly destabilizing one. And while in many ways the disc paintings are a notable advance, their irresolvable problem is that the experience they tried to enable was incompatible with Irwin's decision to remain, however tenuously, within the limitations of the medium of painting. The discs are a high point in the integration of craft and perception, but the experience of the disc is often controlling and exclusionary. So what happened was that Irwin was frustrated by the fact that viewers were not properly experiencing and interacting with these paintings, and therefore not getting that pulsation in their vision. So he resorted to placing tape on the floor to direct the viewer like an actor with their mark in a television show, so that there was He told you exactly where to stand to see the paintings properly. Next slide. So what did perceptual art look like after feminism? It began to take shape in the dome sculptures and plastic paintings that Chicago produced in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And if any of you want to see some fabulous examples of Judy's work from this era and later, please go to the Oslo Kunstverein. I know I'm not pronouncing that properly, but you know where it is. The steps along the way, that is, to a new perceptual art, were worked out empirically. And one of the crucial stages was the color theory that Judy Chicago diagrammed in the catalog for her one artist exhibition at the Pasadena Art Museum in 1969 and made manifest in her domes. And now Judy referred to the domes, and you're seeing these pieces here. The domes are quite intimately scaled, the larger domes being only about 10 by 20 centimeters. They're clear acrylic semi-spheres that are blown into shape. And she colored the domes by spraying and airbrushing them from behind in shades ranging from opalescent white to dark bronze. And they're always displayed in groups of 3 on clear or mirrored acrylic tabletops. So the reflection off of the mirrored table is very important as well. Next slide. The coloring of the domes is systematized. I talked about the color theory. This is her diagram of it. And in the catalog, she explains that the 3 forms provide a framework for the color relationship. I've used different systems. In all of these pieces, there is a 3/6 rhythm, which is a primary color, secondary color module. To make this statement clearer, which is not very clear, Chicago offers diagrams and accompanying descriptions of different series of domes, as in this example, for a series that combines green, purple, and blue. Color in dome diagrammed above is transparent from one view, opaque from the other view. Numerous thin layers of pigment dissolved in clear lacquer produces an iridescent quality. Purple goes to rose, blue goes to aqua, green goes to chartreuse at edges. She is extremely clear as to the formal qualities her color system achieves. Color has become sculptural in the domes, i.e., that is, instead of being on the surface of the piece like a skin, it is integrated totally with the shape and inseparable from it. It is not a sculpture that is painted, but a colored sculpture that is atmospheric and an entity in and of itself. The color glows, reflects light, and is indeterminate in position. These qualities align her with a number of practitioners who are usually described as finish fetish or light and space artists. But Chicago augments their definition of perceptual art, insisting, and this is an important quote, color is directly emotive and sensate, demanding a non-intellectual feeling response. Next slide. To unpack or to explain this feeling response, one needs to turn to Chicago's plastic paintings, which she produced mostly in series, some of which she showed us. Some of the most important being the Pasadena Lifesavers, which you're seeing now, the Fresno Fans, and the Flush Gardens. These series combine large paintings ranging from, and here I've not done a metric conversion, but 5 by 5 feet to 8 by 8 feet, and 5 by 10 foot rectangles, made from sprayed acrylic lacquer on acrylic sheeting that is framed and supported by the same plastic material. To work on plastic paintings of this size, Chicago had to invent specialized studio equipment and build an outsized spray booth. So, another return to kind of industrial craft. Extending from the system of the domes, Chicago developed 3 systems of color for the plastic paintings, as she explained in an artist's statement. The first system is based on color opposites, primarily red, blue, green. The second system uses spectral color and changes from warm to cool. The third system relies upon consecutive color of close value, such as blue, green, chartreuse, and is essentially cool. The earliest series, the Pasadena Lifesavers, feature a central white square, which you can, I think, see, around which float 4 shapes with octagonal, 8-sided centers and circular outer rims. I think it happens even a little bit in the reproduction, but much more in the paintings themselves. The colors create mutable and varied spatial relations, in which some of the shapes seem to spin, while others peak at the center or fluctuate in a manner that makes the shapes pulse in and out of space. The white centers do not maintain themselves as consistent negative space, but at times grasp the edges of the grid, opening and closing and taking on a paler version of the palette of the surrounding rings. Next slide. In the Fresno fans that follow, Chicago makes the spatial color relationship even more complex by placing square shapes on a square grid in a way that destabilizes both elements. Through subtle changes in color, the squares, sometimes individually and sometimes as larger boxes, separate from the grid, literally fanning out, which is why they are called Fresno fans. This movement draws attention to the bars or slits at the center of the painting, which expand and contract amidst the changing location and position of the fans. The next slide. Lastly, the Flesh Gardens, 3rd series, replaced the whirling motion of the Fresno fans with subtle graduated color transformations that continuously return to whiteness, now diffused through the entire surface, before shading to pastels and more intense blues, pinks, greens, and oranges. It is now possible to locate some of the emotions, sensations, and feelings Chicago associated with her color systems. 2 years after her Pasadena catalog, Chicago herself established a more precise definition. The colors allow me to deal with 3 different feeling states, to establish and then break down form, and to manifest a wide range of direct sensations based on a central or female core image. This and similar statements and the fact that Chicago gave some works titles like Click Cunts have caused many critics to reduce the paintings using the dismissive term cunt art. However, Chicago has always taken the more expansive view that the paintings in her color system in general embody a wide range of lived female experience. Returning to the extraordinarily dynamic color relations in these paintings, at different times they seem to breathe, blush, flush, aggressively reach out, assertively take in, and yes, explode in pleasure and bask in afterglow. They did so in a manner that was so radical that many of Chicago's mostly male contemporaries could not or would not see them. Such as this response to an exhibition that included 15 of these paintings by the hapless critic excuse me, of the Los Angeles Times. And there's a quote from him. "Despite feminist statements in the catalog, Judy Chicago's art bears no relationship to names or women's lib." And that's the end of that quote. Unlike Irwin's controlling disc paintings, however, Chicago's work broke down the separation between what was inside and outside the frame in a liberating manner, introducing a perceptual art with a content of embodied female experience that was so new that many men could not recognize it. These works provided a means through which viewers could experience, however briefly, the world and her place in it differently, producing one of the signal achievements of 1970s art. So, next slide. I think you'll recognize the pattern of the talk by now, hopefully. So now we're on to what did place in Los Angeles art look like before feminism. And it looked like Ed Ruscha's photo books. I hope some of you have seen these. That documented everyday aspects of the built environment, like gas stations, next slide, apartment buildings, next slide, and parking lots. And so we're talking about place. And what did Ruscha say of the city in his depictions? Los Angeles is a quote. Los Angeles is to me like a series of storefront planes that are all vertical from the street. And there's almost like nothing behind the facades. It's all facades here. That's what intrigues me about the whole city of Los Angeles, the facadeness of the whole thing. The photo books depicted emptiness, both literal and spatial, that finally becomes almost unbearable. Next slide. This can be seen not only in the photos themselves, but in the overall layout of the books. In 26 gasoline stations, which we're looking at now, there's only one absolutely blank page in the book. Every other page contains either a photo or a caption or both. Next slide. Some Los Angeles apartments has 12 blank pages, which tend to emphasize the isolation and decontextualization of the taller apartment buildings from the general low-density orientation of the city. Next slide. An enormous intensification of nothingness occurs in 34 parking lots, which, although it contains only slightly more blank pages than some Los Angeles apartments, 14, is far more palpably a document of absence. The parking lots are completely empty, except for a few residues of human mechanical evacuation that only accentuate the inhospitable imposition of the various geometric and exacting grids upon the landscape. When Andy Warhol first saw Ruscha's photo books, he reportedly asked him, "How do you get all those pictures without any people in them?" If barrenness is one of the most tangible qualities of the first few Los Angeles photo books, at least the apartment buildings and parking lots hold out the possibility of being filled by human presence. So you can imagine people inside them. Next slide. But beginning with 9 swimming pools, Ruscha's spaces seem to deny full inhabitation. So you're looking at the actual layout of the book. The viewer, reader of 9 swimming pools must literally wade through emptiness. There are only 10 pages with photographs out of 64 pages in the book. And the photographs themselves portray the water as an impenetrable surface, merely a mirror that reflects light, while the entire photographic field is laid out in a manner that leaves no room to be occupied by something as unruly as people. Next slide. In the next to last of Ruscha's books describing Los Angeles, the documentation of emptiness becomes total vacuuming. Real estate opportunities, which you're looking at now, has 21 blank pages, but what his 25 photographs do depict can only be described as a landscape of desolation. What Schei photographed were empty lots, many with for sale signs, and this journey reveals a wasteland that offers about as much chance of successful human habitation as a site of post-nuclear devastation or the surface of the moon. These are particularly the sort of waste ground around Los Angeles. Next slide. But of course, people did live in Los Angeles. And what the feminist artists who produced Woman House were insisting on was an archaeological model of artistic production, an excavation of the house that demanded that sedimented layers of local and personal histories be dug up and examined. In other words, they were saying that places are not merely discovered, as in Schei's work, but rather are made through the exertions and experiences of those who inhabit them. This is a primary reason that the remodeling of the building was such an essential part of the project. Woman House is the physical instantiation of the collective sweat and labor of the women who produced it. Pardon. But sweat was not the only bodily reference that defined the relationship of artwork and place. One of the rooms that generated the most attention was the nurturing kitchen, which you're looking at now, created by Vicky Hodgetts, Suzanne Fraser, and Robin Welch. Painted completely in bright pink, including the canned goods and appliances, the room had vacuum-formed plastic curtains by Wanda West Coast, which you're looking at now. There were also several portraits of notable women, such as Angela Davis, many of you may know the activist, with definite political overtones. Next slide. In this fleshy room, fried eggs made from sponges transform into breasts as they cascade down from ceiling to walls, and then back to eggs as they approach the stove. The home is here a place of sustenance where people eat, suckle, and grow. But even in the kitchen, the inequalities of gender are made manifest as the insides of the drawers, you can't really see this photograph, featured collages of exotic locales that represented the fantasy travel that might have been in the minds of the women trapped at home in their kitchens. Next slide. In the dollhouse, Miriam Shapiro and Sherry Brody's House Within a House, it was quite a large dollhouse, but it was within the house. The dangers of the domestic sphere vie prominently with its safety and comfort. Birds peck at rocks. A rattlesnake curls up on the floor of the parlor. Outside a window, a grizzly bear regards the baby in a crib. Downstairs, 10 men peer into the kitchen. And then next slide. However, the home is also portrayed as a productive space, a place to develop a career. A man models nude in the skylighted studio, bananas at his feet. An artist lives here, and it is clear that she is a woman. Next slide. Finally, Judy Chicago's menstruation bathroom made manifest a history and a realm of experience that good taste of the era demanded be kept hidden. The display was a white bathroom with a shelf of feminine hygiene products in boxes and a trash can full of used tampons and sanitary napkins. The intense whiteness of the space contrasting with the red in a dramatic, perceptual way, a very different meaning of perceptual art. Visitors were not permitted to enter the bathroom, but had to view it through a sheet of gauze suspended in the doorway. The veiling demonstrated that space was not the neutral substance that Irwin and Schei's work presupposes, but what is inside and outside the frame is always already thoroughly gendered, as is vision itself. So what this talk has sought to argue is that early feminism did not enact a complete break with the art that preceded it in Southern California. Rather, its radicality lies to a degree, and of course in many other ways it was a complete break. But for this talk, its radicality lies to a degree in the manner in which it recasts terms such as craft, perception, and place that were already deeply rooted, usually by shifting them from the universal and the aesthetic to the cultural and the specific. In other words, what Judy described as giving content. Across such feminist projects as Woman House is the perceptual goal of seeing beyond the frame, in this case the strictures of patriarchal society, by allowing viewers to see the world differently and forcing them out of ingrained habits. These communal undertakings recast sexuality as gender, foregrounding societal roles instead of biology. Chicago and her fellow feminist artists had the courage to embrace bad taste, both socially and aesthetically, and certainly this would have considered bad taste in every way. Betraying the good taste that women were above all meant to police, and insisting that major art could be rooted in their experiences. In doing so, they created modes of art making that can still be an inspiration today. Thank you.